right, so this week we're going to be talking about social credit, Douglas social credit, and usury, right? And the first thing I think that I should point out is that many people labor under this misapprehension, even some of them uh, people that have studied Douglas social credit. They think that according to Douglas's diagnosis, the problem with the existing financial system is the fact that banks charge interest on the credits that they create and lend, and that this is, in many cases, exploitative, unjust, fraudulent, because, of course, the banks create the money that they lend out of nothing. They're not lending other people's money. And so one of the confusions that we have to sort of clear away from the get-go is that usury is not the key or fundamental problem. However you define usury, and that's a whole other discussion, but usury is not the key or the fundamental problem with the existing financial system, according to the analysis put forward by C.H. Douglas. Right? So Douglas talks about a lack of consumer buying power, a lack of consumer purchasing power, and what causes that lack is fundamentally an accounting problem, a problem dealing with cost accountancy regulations and their interaction with the creation and destruction of money in the financial system. And it's got nothing to do, the fundamental problem has nothing to do with usury or interest as such. So the idea is that even if the rate of interest were zero, were nothing, there would still be this gap between the rates at which costs and prices are generated in the system versus the simultaneous rates at which incomes are distributed to consumers. Right? So we really need to make clear that usury is not what social credit focuses on, right? Social credit is not proposing that the solution to the problem is we just get rid of banks charging interest and then the financial system will be fine. Right? The fundamental problem goes beyond any question of usury and needs to be solved in a way that gets at the heart of the issue. So I don't know if, Michael, if you've ever encountered people that sort of want to reduce social credit to some talk about usury or charging of interest and think, oh, well, the problem is interest, and so the solution is to get rid of interest, problem solved. So, social credit is basically interest-free credit, and that's all there is to it. I don't know if you've ever maybe encountered that online or even in discussions with various people.
Oh yes, I've encountered that a fair bit. People that often people like classical distributors, people concerned about modern banking and usury and debt and interest-bearing loans, and rightly so, they are concerned. Certainly a legitimate concern. And it's quite often that the diagnosis of the problems in the financial system just exclusively or for the most part falls just to usury, that is the banks charging interest on their loans issued.
Okay. So at the same time, in order to be balanced in this, Douglas is on record in various parts of his writings where he says, that bank profits are exorbitant. He finds them exorbitant under the existing system. There are other places where he describes the existing financial system as the most colossal, lucrative fraud ever imposed on mankind. So when we say that usury, properly defined, I think, as economic rent in banking, and we'll come back to that point in a moment, when we say that usury is not the fundamental, the core problem, that's not to say that it isn't a feature of the existing financial system. And it's also not to say that the social credit remedial proposals would not get rid of it or at least significantly attenuate it just as a byproduct. And we'll explain how that works a little later on as well, right? So they do have legitimate concerns insofar as, for some people under the existing financial system, bank charges, service charges, and interest charges can be onerous, right? Very heavy. A burden for them, can be exploitative, where they're basically forced into a position where they have to pay banks lots of money over many, many years, could even be more than the actual principal in the case of a mortgage. So it can be onerous, it can be exploitative, it can be excessive, right? All these conditions can attach to the paying of interest depending on who you are in the present economic system. There are many third world countries that have paid their original debts over several times to first world banks or other first world entities because they have these interest charges. So there certainly are cases where under the existing rules, people are being taken advantage of, or the interest itself is excessive, is a burden that then prevents them from spending money on things that actually meet their needs. And I think we need to be aware of this and sensitive of this, and not just sort of ignore it and not validate the concerns that various people have. I don't know. Do you have any stories you can tell on that score? Any people that sort of have been heavily burdened with interest charges?
Oh yes, well, I know many people that even just mortgage holders, for instance, people who have bought homes and have borrowed large sums of money from the bank, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And over the course of their life, that they, of course, then have to spend paying that off. They end up paying double or even more than double of what they actually have paid for the house, or what they've been borrowed from the bank to pay for the house.
Right. So depending on what the interest rates are, it can be double, triple, quadruple.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
That's right. So they end up, there's businesses or individuals end up actually paying double for what they actually supposedly bought the product for.
Right.
Just to repaying the loans that were issued to them by these banks.
So the intangible numbers that are created ex nihilo by the bank, and that's a costless operation, considered as an isolated operation. It's costless. These intangible numbers can be quite expensive, right?
They sure can.
And it's you can see why people would object to those sorts of interest, paying that sort of interest over that period of time. Now, on the other side of the equation, it's clear, of course, that banks have real costs, right? They've got all sorts of expenses that they have to meet, operating expenses, salaries, office supplies, office equipment, utilities, areas that they either rent or purchase to set up their banks and so forth. And so we recognize that the banks have all sorts of expenses, and those expenses have to be met somehow in order for the bank to function. Right? So there are some people, in this whole sort of question of interest and usury, there are some people that go to the extreme of saying, well, the banks should just offer loans for nothing, basically, or have small service fees. And the thing is, if the banks offered their services but charged very small sums, token sums, they may not be getting enough money back in revenue to cover their expenses. And that, of course, would be an unjust situation as well. They have to be able to cover their expenses like any other business in order to function, right? So and it's sort of a secondary matter whether the bank charges service fees, whether they call what they charge service fees or interest, because whether it takes the form of a service fee or an interest charge, you can arrange those charges in such a way that they are enough to ensure that the bank's costs are being met. So it's sort of a secondary issue where interest sort of becomes a problem. Is specifically in the situations we're describing where you've got a loan that's out for a very long period of time, and because that interest is not simple interest but compound interest, where they're charging interest on interest, you end up with a situation where the longer the term of the loan, the more interest you're going to have to pay overall. The curve rises exponentially. And so, you could say one of the problems with the existing setup too is that there's no linear connection necessarily between the interest that you have to pay and the actual costs that you're causing the bank to incur. Right? So if you have a loan, if for example I borrow $1 million but I pay it back in a year, the interest is going to be a lot less than if I take 30 years, well, let's say, on a mortgage to pay it back. And it's not at all clear that the longer you have out the loan, that the actual costs of the bank are increasing exponentially the way the interest curve increases exponentially. So that shows you that there's sort of a misalignment between what the costs are actually incurring and then what they're charging the consumer. And that speaks to the fact that under the existing system, money is very much a commodity. It's treated as a commodity. Yes. That's held in artificial supply, and therefore the banks view themselves as sort of like landowners. They're able to rent the money supply, and to whether it's to businesses or to consumers or to governments, and they're entitled therefore to charge simply for giving people access to this commodity. And that's where the whole question of economic rent taking in the banking industry enters into the picture. And I think that that's really what usury is, right? I don't think you can define usury as the mere charging of interest, because you could have a situation in which the banks charge a very, very, very small, a very low rate of interest, a small amount. And it's so small, so low, that they're not able to cover their expenses, right? If let's say the banks charge 0.1% interest on all their loans, they wouldn't have enough money coming in as revenue to cover their expenses. And that would mean basically that the borrowers would be taking advantage of the banks. And that wouldn't be a just or fair situation either. So obviously, they've got to cover enough to cover their legitimate. They've got to charge enough to cover their legitimate expenses, right? But what sort of profits should they be able to make above that? If we were in a perfectly competitive market, if we had a perfectly competitive market in banking, surely their profits would be much lower than they are currently. And so the difference between the profits they would be making, let's say, in a perfectly competitive market and the profits that they actually do make, we can regard those profits as oligopoly profits, as forms of economic rent. And in Canada, for example, we've got 5 or 6 big banks, and you've got 5 or 6 big banks in Australia. In Canada, the banks, these are their declared profits. I mean, there are all sorts of other ways of hiding profits that they make, but their declared profits are of the order of billions of dollars, right?
Yes.
Billions of dollars every year. And so, it's a legitimate question. How much of that is actually economic rent and is therefore usury? Right?
Yep.
Now, I don't know if there's anything on anything that I've just said, the fact that money is treated as a commodity and therefore they think that they're entitled to charge excessive amounts for it if they can get away with it, if we don't have a perfectly competitive market.
Well, Oliver, I think you pretty much spelled it out. There's a clear difference between banks charging some degree of interest to cover their overhead costs, and as opposed to charging exorbitant interest just to commoditize money to make a profit off money itself with economic rents.
Right.
So there's a clear difference, distinction between what's usury and what's not usury when it comes to charging interest.
Now, where Douglas social credit comes into the picture is that Douglas, of course, was critical of what he called the monopoly of credit. Right now,
Yes.
the banking industry has a monopoly on the credit they create for loans and the credit they use to buy securities and so forth. And Douglas wants to break that monopoly, and he breaks it by having the National Credit Authority create consumer credits for the national dividend and for the compensated price. And so what would happen if you broke that commodity? Well, if you broke that monopoly? Well, the first thing I think we need to state is that from a social credit point of view, and if we had a social credit system, money would not be regarded as a commodity, right? In social credit, money is just a neutral instrument that we use as sort of a piece of information to produce whatever we want and need and to distribute that adequately to the consuming public and to meet the costs of production. So it's going to be like a neutral a neutral accounting medium, let's put it that way. It's not to be treated as a commodity that is to be bought and sold, at charging of oligopoly rates of interest.
Yeah.
And so if we have a system where consumers, for example, are fully enfranchised with purchasing power, that they can meet the costs of whatever the economy produces without having to borrow more money into existence from the private banks, then it stands to reason that all the interest then that the banks currently charge on car loans, mortgages, student loans, lines of credit, credit cards, etc., all of that interest would be eliminated, right?
Yes.
And that, the anti-usury crowd should be particularly happy about that.
That's right.
And the same thing also applies to government loans. So the government could borrow whatever money it needs. All levels of government, federal, state, provincial, municipal, could borrow whatever money they require to operate from the National Credit Authority, and they could do it simply at the cost of administration. They wouldn't have to borrow from private banks. And there again, that would reduce the amount of money that the taxpayer would be on the hook for, because we wouldn't have to pay all this money in interest. Right?
Yeah.
So that again
that's
also reduces sort of the interest burden.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. It's what it would mean is when every citizen is enfranchised with the dividend and his purchasing power would be able to go further with the compensated price index. That would mean there will be far less need or necessity or desire or temptation to want to take out loans from banks. So you could eliminate a lot of bank loans altogether rather than just remove the interest paid on them.
Well, as a matter of fact, borrowing new money into existence from banks for consumer purposes would be impossible under social credit. So, I mean, it would have to be prohibited. There still probably would be some market for consumer loans, but that would have to involve borrowing of pre-existing money rather than the borrowing of new money into existence, as is typically the case now. So, interest on new debt money for consumers, that would be eliminated. Interest on government debt, that would be eliminated. as far as the private banks were concerned. And so the only question would be, what would happen with producer loans? And because those would be basically the only services that the banks then would provide would be loans to private productive organizations. And there, obviously, as I said before, the banks would have to charge, whether it's in the form of a service fee or interest, they would have to charge enough to be able to cover their costs, right?
Yeah.
And this is going, what I'm going to suggest now goes beyond anything that Douglas said. But I've written an article on this, and it's a suggestion for how to deal with the question of bank charges under social credit. And I'll put the article in the description so that people can read it if they're interested. But there is a concern that one of the inequities with the present system is that the banks don't fully share in the risk of the productive organizations that they lend to. So, right, the banks are the creditors that are paid off first if the business goes bankrupt or what have you. And so one way of getting around that and also dealing with any lingering question of usury is to set up a situation in which the banks would only make a profit on loans to productive organizations if those productive organizations are actually making a profit. You see?
Yes.
So the idea was that when they make a loan to a corporation or to a small business, the terms of the loan would say, well, you have to pay us so much to cover our operating fees. But beyond that, we are going to be entitled to 10% or 15% or whatever it is of the profit. Right? And if the company then fails, and the bank it's evident that the bank has made a bad lending decision by lending to a company that's not able to make a profit, then neither the company nor the bank, of course, would be in a position to make any profit at all. And that would serve as a feedback loop where the banks then are sharing to a greater extent in the fate of the enterprises that they lend to. So if the the business just breaks even, right, the bank won't lose out on its loan. Its loan will be paid back, and it will be able to cover its expenses, but it won't be making a profit.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That makes perfect sense. So it will certainly make private banks more accountable for their actions. So they don't go creating and issuing loans that people, individuals, or companies cannot afford to pay off, and they still hold them in debt slavery.
That's right.
Despite that. So this will certainly it will hold the private banks to account and enforce a real profit motive. If a bank is if a bank is to issue a private bank is to issue a loan, there has to be incentive on the part of the bank to issue that loan. Otherwise, it won't be profitable or beneficial to that bank.
Right. So if you tie the incentive to the profitability of the company, then banks are going to be more careful.
That's right. Exactly.
About whom they lend money to, because of course their profits then would be at stake. They're not going to be the first creditors to be paid off if there are problems.
They're reliant on the companies or individuals to make a profit, and not the other way around.
Yes. So there are many cases where right now it's occurs that the banks cover their costs and they make profits no matter what. And that sort of puts them in a superior position. And so what we're suggesting is that the banks need to be more partners and be at the same level as everybody else in the economy, rather than the sort of the dominating economic agents as they are currently.
That's right.
I should mention, to sort of not placate, placate's not the right word, but to sort of head off any criticism that may be arising in the minds of free market types, that, as I said in a previous video, the free market only gives all the benefits that we associate with free markets, proper allocation of resources and efficient use of resources and capitalist justice and all these wonderful things. It only provides these benefits when it's also a perfectly competitive market. And in many countries, we don't have perfectly competitive markets in banking. We've got what are, in fact, oligopoly markets. And an oligopoly market that operates within the context of a deeper and more fundamental monopoly, since the banking system is, for all intents and purposes, the source of all money. Right?
Yes.
Why should that be, and how does that affect the wider economy? Right. So if you change the rules of the system, and we do what we're suggesting, and hold the banks accountable, and put them in a position where they are basically forced to operate under conditions of perfect competition, then actually everyone should benefit. And the free marketers should be the people who are most in favor of making regulatory changes, if in fact they do end up producing a market that is more in line with what the textbooks say free markets should be like.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It's for them and their own cause of private enterprise and their
competition,
competition and innovation and freedom to do business. Having a just and fair monetary system and banking system that will allow and promote their freedom to do business without impinging on the common good or on the dignity or security of individuals. It really would be of such great benefit to them and their cause. So it really is it's a logical course of action.
Yes. The only other thing that I think maybe I might mention is that when it comes to these long-term loans in which compound interest is charged and on which the rate of interest owing rises exponentially, I find that personally so illogical and unfair that I avoid such loans on principle. I actually have no debt at all. I don't mind, buying something on a credit card if I pay it off at the end of the month and they charge me $3-4 interest. I think that's fine. I don't have any big objection about that because they're offering these services. But when it comes to long-term loans where you're paying thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest over the term of the loan, I do find that very oppressive. And so I avoid those loans on principle. I don't know about your situation, or whether you care to share any details of your situation.
I do have a mortgage on a home, the property that I own. So that's probably, at least according to my bank, if I pay it off at the rate that I am currently paying into it each fortnight, provided that would be without me dipping extra money into it, which I do each year. It said something on the lines of 24 or 26 years or something like that. And if you consider you're paying down the loan plus the interest, that's the amount of interest I'll be paying at the end of the day would be enormous. That's all my wages, earned
Mhm.
wages, and
Mhm.
life savings
And
gone to the
for goodness sake, yeah, going to the bankers, but for goodness sake, you would prefer to keep that money in your pocket and spend it on other things.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, absolutely,
Hmm.
yeah. Instead, a substantial portion of my hard-earned money is just being taken and destroyed by the banks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's a form of theft.
Yes. Well, when it comes to
An extortion, professional
yeah,
extortion.
when it takes the form of economic rent, yes, I agree that
Yeah,
that is a form of theft. You
yeah,
know, because especially under the existing system where there's not enough money, um, you know, people aren't paid enough often to meet the cost of living, to meet living expenses. They have no choice but to borrow, and so that's where
that's right.
the exploitation comes in. When you basically, you know, figuratively, you're holding a gun to someone's head, and you're basically creating conditions where they have to borrow to live. Then they don't have any choice,
Yes,
and so they have to
that's right.
accept
Well,
whatever
that's
terms are imposed.
exactly, and that's pretty much what we're living under now. We have
Mm.
proverbial gun pointed to our head.
Mm-hmm.
You will borrow money at large interest, and you
Mm-hmm.
will like it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
have a significant portion of your life savings and earnings
Mm-hmm.
taken from you and destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, you know, in the sort of in the broad picture of things, we have a situation where many people are working very hard, and you know their incomes are being siphoned off in various directions, right? So they've got a lot of taxes that they have to pay, not all of which they receive back in, you know, equivalent value in goods and services, because of course governments have to pay interest on long-term loans and short-term loans. You've got a situation where people, if they have personal debt, they've got to be paying interest as well. And
Mm.
so even, you know, there's interest, of course, charged in the goods and services we buy. And so there's a potential there for there to be economic rent if we're talking about long-term business loans, you know, upon which large sums of interest are charged. We might be paying for that in the goods and services that we buy as well. So all of these things, and again, we're not saying that banks shouldn't charge for their expenses, their operating expenses. We're not even saying
No,
that banks shouldn't make a profit. It's a question of what degree of profit is reasonable. What would it be under conditions of perfect competition, and how much of it actually qualifies as economic rent under the existing system. And but insofar as there is economic rent under the existing system, then you know quite clearly people are losing purchasing power. That's money that they could have kept for
mm,
themselves. They could have spent on other things. And
that's right.
yeah, you have a lot of people that spend a lot of their working life working for the government on the one hand, and then working for the banks on the other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. That's
Uh,
right. Between the banks and the government, we spend a vast majority of the year
mm,
working for either two.
for one or the two, yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, so I think
All right.
we've covered a lot of bases. Is there anything else you wanted to
Yes.
mention? Okay.
Um, Not that I can think of. I think we pretty much covered all the bases, Oliver.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So if readers have any questions, feel free to post those questions in the
Yeah.
comments section, and please subscribe. And we will be joining you next week for another riveting episode of Heydorn and Watson.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
We'll see you later, Michael.
See you later, Oliver. Bye bye.
Bye.